The patrol car smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, a scent Officer Miles Corbin had grown to associate with the dead hours between 2 and 4 a.m. in the city of Havenwood. He was a creature of routine, and routine was the bedrock of this quiet, almost sterile coastal town, a town where the most exciting call was usually a misplaced raccoon or a particularly spirited teenage house party. Miles was 42, divorced, and carried the weight of a decade in the force not in his shoulders, but in the permanent, weary slump of his expression. His partner, rookie officer Kaylin K. Sharma, was his antithesis, sharp, perpetually wired on caffeine, and always looking for the angle, the one thing the crime blotter missed. Tonight, they were running their Sector 4 circuit, the sprawling, mostly abandoned industrial park that bordered the dense, ancient woods. "Anything interesting on the wire, Kay?" Miles asked, his voice low and gravelly, barely disturbing the stillness of the cab. Kay, fiddling with the dash-mounted tablet, scoffed. "Just a 10 to 56 on Elm Street, dispute over a misplaced lawn gnome. Riveting stuff." She glanced out the window at the skeletal, rusted remains of the old shipbuilding yards. "Seriously, why do they have us run this route every night? It's a ghost town." Even the junkies moved on. Miles just kept his eyes on the road. "Protocol. And it's not a ghost town. It's a quiet town. Difference is, a quiet town can get loud fast." They drove past the hulking, shadow-eaten warehouse of the defunct Northstar Logistics. It was massive, a black, rectangular scar against the thin moonlight. That was when Kay caught it. "Hold up, Miles. Back up a hair." Miles, already braking, gave her a questioning look. "What is it? Did you see that third window from the left on the upper floor of Northstar?" He reversed slowly, the cruiser's tires crunching softly on the asphalt littered with years of industrial dust. He stared. The window was dark, dusty, and framed by broken, rattling panes. "See what, Kay? Looks like a broken window in a condemned building." "No, look closer. Right there, in the center pane." Kay leaned forward, pointing. It was a movement. Not a reflection. Something inside. Miles grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and directed the beam toward the upper floor. The dust motes in the air caught the light, but the window remained stubbornly opaque. "Could be a bird. Or a loose piece of siding in the wind." "Miles, it's a sealed warehouse. No wind gets in there to move anything, and it was too slow for a bird. It was like a hand. Just a flicker. Look." As if on cue, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift of shadow occurred behind the glass. It wasn't a distinct shape, just a sudden, anomalous compression of the darkness, a momentary absence of even the faint background blackness. Miles felt the familiar, cold knot of unease tighten in his gut. This wasn't the usual boredom. This felt wrong. The Northstar building had been vacant for 8 years after a massive internal collapse, and city ordinances had made it clear, no entry, 0 exceptions. He cut the engine. The silence that fell over the patrol car was heavy, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant, rhythmic clang of a buoy bell out in the harbor. "Call it in," Miles ordered, his hand resting on his sidearm. "Tell dispatch we have an unauthorized entry, possible squatters, at Northstar Logistics. Request backup, but tell them to take their time. Let's do a perimeter check." Kay's hands were suddenly steady on the radio. Her voice, when she spoke, was crisp, adrenaline replacing caffeine. 10 to 4, dispatch. Unauthorized entry at Northstar Logistics, Sector 4. Holding position for now. Miles and Kay stepped out of the cruiser. The air immediately felt heavier, colder, despite the late summer night. The moment they left the circle of the car's headlights, the world became a claustrophobic maze of shadows and angles. "Stay close," Miles murmured, leading the way toward the main loading dock, a vast, rusted metal door that spanned the width of the building. As they reached the door, Kay froze. She gripped Miles's arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. "Miles," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The silence. Miles listened. The crickets were gone. The buoy bell had stopped. The vast, empty silence of the industrial park had swallowed every natural sound. It was the deepest, most unsettling quiet he had ever experienced then, from the absolute blackness within the warehouse. A noise began. It wasn't a thump, or a shout, or the scrape of metal. It was a rhythmic, wet, and utterly deliberate splatter. Like a heavy, viscous liquid hitting concrete, once every 3 seconds. Plop. 3 seconds of silence. Plop. Kay raised her flashlight, the beam trembling as it hit the rusted door. What the hell is that? Miles didn't answer. He was staring at the base of the door, where, even in the dim light, a dark, thick liquid was beginning to ooze out from under the gap. It wasn't water. It was too dark, too viscous. It was the color of old, oxidized blood. Plop, and then, a sound that cut through the silence like a scalpel, a slow, dragging sound, as if something incredibly heavy was being pulled across the warehouse floor from deep within. Miles drew his gun, the action a familiar, comforting weight in his hand. Backup is 5 minutes out. We wait. Nobody goes inside until they get here. As he spoke, a high, thin sound, like a rusted hinge slowly opening, emanated from the darkness above them. Miles shone his flashlight up. On the third-floor window, the same window Kay had spotted the movement in. The hand was no longer a flicker pressed against the dusty pane, casting a distorted, elongated shadow in the beam of Miles's light. Was an impossible, splayed silhouette. It was too large to be human, with fingers that looked more like the tines of a rake. And slowly, agonizingly, it began to write on the dirty glass, leaving a clean, clear track that revealed the darkness within. The message it scrawled was simple. You're already here. Miles felt the blood drain from his face. He didn't need to check on Kay, he could hear her sharp, ragged intake of breath beside him. The thing was waiting. And the wet plop continued, relentless, counting down to something Miles knew, with terrifying certainty, he did not want to see. The message on the window glass, "You're already here," was a gut punch. It wasn't a warning, it was a statement of proximity, of control. Miles didn't flinch, but his grip on his Beretta tightened until his knuckles were white. He lowered his flashlight, aiming it at the pool of dark, viscous liquid that was now spreading farther from beneath the loading dock door. Kay, breathing shallowly beside him, raised her radio. "Dispatch, disregard the slow approach. We need immediate, rapid response at Northstar Logistics, Sector 4. Repeat, rapid response. We have a high-priority situation, possible barricaded suspect, and evidence of significant injury." She swallowed hard, struggling to keep the tremor out of her voice. "Officer needs assistance." Miles pulled his partner back, away from the immediate shadow of the wall. "Don't engage, Kay. We hold the perimeter. Let's get eyes on the other side." They moved swiftly but silently around the corner of the massive building. The sound of the wet plop, that sickening, rhythmic splatter, was now muffled but still audible, a metronome counting time on their terror. "Miles, did you see the size of that thing's hand?" Kay whispered, her eyes wide, staring back at the loading dock. It wasn't human. It was way too big, too skeletal. "I saw it," Miles confirmed, his focus entirely on the building's windows and fire escapes. "Whatever is in there, it knows we're here. And it's not looking to just squat." They reached the west side of the warehouse, which bordered a steep, overgrown embankment leading down to a tidal marsh. Here, the building was slightly less fortified. A small, rusty maintenance door stood ajar by a few inches, held only by a heavy, corroded chain that was fastened with a flimsy padlock. The padlock looked recently forced. "Bingo," Miles muttered. He aimed his flashlight into the gap. The beam cut into a deep, choking darkness that smelled like stagnant water, mildew, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like fresh blood. Then, from inside, they heard the distinct sound of a distant, faint whimper. It was brief, desperate, and unmistakably human. Miles looked at Kay. All police protocol screamed at them to wait for backup, to contain the situation. But the sound of that whimper, the raw, undeniable sound of a person in pain and fear, shredded the last of Miles's restraint. Forget backup, he decided instantly. There might be a victim. Kay, cover me. If anything moves, you shoot. Aim for center mass. He pulled a small, heavy-duty crowbar from his belt kit, slid the end into the gap of the door, and applied pressure. The ancient, rusted chain protested with a high-pitched, grinding squeal that seemed deafening in the unnatural silence. The flimsy padlock gave way with a sharp snap. Miles nudged the door open just enough for them to slip through, then motioned for Kay to follow. They were instantly plunged into an absolute, inky blackness. Miles's powerful tactical flashlight illuminated a small, immediate circle, a narrow, grimy corridor lined with shelves holding empty, rusted canisters. The air was thick, heavy, and cold enough to see their breath mist. "It's like a freezer in here," Kay whispered, pulling her heavy jacket tighter. "They shut off the power years ago. This place should be sweltering," Miles noted, his heart pounding a dull rhythm against his ribs. They moved cautiously down the corridor. The sickening plop sound was louder now, closer, echoing eerily off the high, cavernous ceiling somewhere deeper inside the structure. Miles paused, holding his breath, listening for the whimper again. Instead, they heard a new sound, one that raised the hairs on the back of his neck, a dry, scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across concrete, rapidly approaching their location. "Get behind cover," Miles hissed. They ducked instantly behind a massive, stacked metal crate. Miles pressed his back against the cold metal, aiming his gun toward the entrance. The scraping stopped dead, right outside their hiding spot. The silence returned, so profound it was painful. Miles could hear only the frantic pulse in his own ears. Then, a voice, raspy and barely audible, emanated from the darkness just inches from their heads, a chilling, mocking whisper that seemed to belong nowhere and everywhere all at once. "I found you." Part 3 will focus on the immediate confrontation and escape, leading to the discovery of a chilling, meticulously arranged scene and the first physical evidence of the thing inside. The whisper was close, right beside them, impossibly low and wet, like breath filtering through decaying tissue. Miles didn't hesitate. He swung his tactical flashlight out from behind the crate, activating the high beam strobe. The blinding, pulsating white light caught something tall, thin, and unnervingly still. It wasn't the hulking figure Miles half expected. It was a man, dressed in a tattered, dark gray maintenance jumpsuit, his back toward them. He was unnaturally lean, almost emaciated, and the way he held his arms, long, dangling, and ending in huge, oversized hands, made him look like a broken puppet. He was standing over a section of the concrete floor that was covered in the same dark, viscous fluid they had seen oozing from the loading dock. He wasn't looking at them, he was fixated on the floor. Kay screamed, a strangled, tight sound that she instantly choked back. The man didn't react to the light or the scream. He simply used one of his elongated, skeletal fingers to complete a final, deliberate swirl in the thick liquid on the floor. Miles, seizing the moment of distraction, barked an order. "Police! Drop your weapon. Hands where I can see them." The man finally turned. Miles staggered back a step, nearly falling over the crate. The man's face was not what he expected. It wasn't monstrous or snarling, it was completely, disturbingly black. His eyes were wide and milky white, and his skin was drawn tight over his facial bones, giving him the look of a skull draped in thin, pale leather. But the most unsettling feature was the absolute, total absence of expression, suggesting a mind that was either completely empty or profoundly detached. And he was holding a weapon, not a knife or a gun, but a long, rusty metal hook, the kind used for hauling heavy cargo, and it was dripping with the dark fluid. The sound of the dripping plop suddenly made terrible, sickening sense. Before Miles could fire, the man moved. He didn't run or attack, he simply turned and disappeared around the far corner of the corridor with a swift, shuffling motion, vanishing into the deep darkness with unnatural speed. "Miles! Don't follow!" Kay yelled, clutching her own gun, her voice shaking violently. "Let him go. We need to find the victim." The reminder of the whimper galvanized Miles. He lowered his gun slightly, keeping it aimed, and advanced, his light sweeping the area where the suspect had been. The thick, dark fluid on the floor was definitely blood, now drying to a dark, tar-like consistency. But it wasn't just a pool. The man had been meticulously arranging it. Etched into the concrete, using the blood as ink, was a symbol. It was a simple, yet profoundly disturbing, geometric shape, 3 overlapping, uneven circles, connected by jagged lines that resembled teeth. It looked less like graffiti and more like a terrifying, alien blueprint. What the hell is that? Kay whispered, her flashlight illuminating the grotesque pattern. It's an offering, Miles said, his voice flat, his gaze tracking the trail of blood and drag marks leading deeper into the warehouse. Or a signature. We're not dealing with a normal squatter, Kay. He followed the trail, Kay close behind. The dragging sound had stopped, but the rhythmic plop was still somewhere ahead. The corridor opened up into the main, vast warehouse floor, a dizzying, echoing space that felt like the belly of a dead whale. Massive steel support columns disappeared into the shadows high above. Miles shined his light across the floor and stopped dead. The source of the whimper was revealed, but not in the way they hoped. Lying in the center of a wide, illuminated circle of concrete was a body. It was a young man, dressed in jeans and a hoodie, clearly a victim. But he wasn't simply dead. He was arranged that he was propped up, sitting bolt upright, leaning against a stack of meticulously organized, empty wooden pallets. His eyes were wide open in a silent scream. His throat was horribly lacerated, the wound clean and deep. The final, chilling detail was the object resting gently on his chest, where his heart lay. It was a single, pristine white bird feather, placed there with deliberate care. Miles approached, his boots sticking slightly to the floor. He knelt, checking for a pulse he knew wouldn't be there. The skin was already icy cold. He's been dead for hours, Miles, Kay said, her voice strained. She stared at the feather. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was art. As she spoke, the rhythmic plop sound finally stopped. The deep silence of the warehouse returned, heavier and more complete than before. Miles stood up, his gaze drawn to the ceiling. High above, on a rusty metal catwalk connecting 2 major sections of the warehouse, a small, dark shadow flickered into existence. It was too distant to identify, but it was there, watching them. Kay, Miles said, not taking his eyes off the shadow. The backup. Where are they? Just as he finished the question, a sound that had been absent since they entered the building suddenly roared to life. Not from the outside, but from the far end of the warehouse, near the loading dock they had first approached. The immense, rusted metal loading door began to groan and drag slowly shut, sealing their only way back out. The way they came, they were trapped. The slamming of the enormous loading dock door echoed through the vast space, a final, deafening pronouncement of their entrapment. Kay spun, training her flashlight and pistol on the sound. He's sealing us in. We need to get out now. Miles didn't move towards the door. It was too massive, too old, and whatever force was operating it was too swift. He kept his eyes glued to the high catwalk where the dark shadow had momentarily appeared. It was gone now, but the distinct feeling of being watched was suffocating. We find another way out, Miles stated, his voice tight but controlled. He knew panicking now was fatal. There has to be a service exit, a fire escape. Kay, check the perimeter, stay low. I'm going to focus on this symbol. Kay reluctantly turned from the door, her light dancing nervously over the skeletal steel structure. Miles, meanwhile, returned his attention to the geometric symbol scrawled in blood near the victim, the 3 overlapping circles. He knelt down, tracing the pattern with his gloved finger, an icy cold spreading through his hand. It felt vaguely familiar, like something he'd seen in a cold case file from years ago that never quite closed. Miles, Kay hissed from about 20 feet away, her voice strained. There's something here. Next to the columns. Miles joined her. Lined up against a series of 4 steel support columns was a chilling collection of objects. They weren't weapons or tools. They were personal effects, carefully arranged in ascending order of size. First, a child's small, wooden spinning top. Next, a woman's faded silver locket. Then, a man's battered leather wallet, empty. And finally, a meticulously folded, yellowed newspaper clipping. Miles picked up the clipping with the tip of his knife. The paper was brittle, the ink faint. The date at the top read October 1978. The headline was stark, local fisherman missing, suspected drowning off Havenwood coast. The article detailed the disappearance of a local man named Samuel Croft, whose boat was found empty. The article mentioned he was last seen near the Northstar dock, complaining of strange noises and lights in the marsh. 47 years ago, Kay murmured, reading over his shoulder. Why are these here? Is this guy a serial killer collecting trophies from history? Miles shook his head, looking back at the 3 overlapping circles in blood. Look closer, Kay. These aren't trophies. They're milestones. Every object here is decades older than the last victim. The locket looks like the 50s. The spinning top could be from the 20s. He pointed to the wallet. Samuel Croft was a man who disappeared near here, and his personal item is the largest, placed right before the most recent victim. A horrifying thought crystallized in Miles's mind. This isn't a collection of random victims, Kay. This is a progression. Whatever is doing this, it has been active here for decades, maybe a century, and it's slowly escalating its activity, moving from simply making people disappear to arranging them. As he spoke, a sound that was too loud, too close, made them both jump back, the heavy, metallic sound of a chain rapidly being drawn up, column by column. They swung their lights up. Above them, dangling from the central steel beams, were long, thick industrial chains, formerly used to move heavy cargo. And one by one, the chains were being drawn up into the ceiling girders, accompanied by a deafening, groaning ratchet noise. The unseen entity wasn't just sealing the doors, it was preparing the space. He's hurting us, Miles realized, his voice a strained whisper. He's closing off the vertical space. He wants us down here, on the ground floor. Then, a sound came from the darkness behind a stack of empty barrels near the marsh side wall, a faint, desperate clatter. Fire exit, Kay gasped, pointing her light. They saw it, a rusted, push-bar door, barely visible, but the lock mechanism looked intact, suggesting it wasn't the way their assailant had entered, but the barrels were blocking the direct route. We moved the barrels, quietly. Miles ordered. They began to push the heavy steel drums aside. The noise was unavoidable, a terrible, booming gong as the steel scraped against the concrete. Just as they cleared the final barrel and reached the fire exit, a high-pitched, mocking giggle echoed from the main section of the warehouse. It wasn't the rasping voice of the man in the jumpsuit, it was a pure, childlike sound, impossibly loud and close. And then, the light dot, a single, powerful spotlight, not theirs, suddenly illuminated the back of the fire exit door, casting their long, terrified shadows against the wall. The light was emanating from the far side of the warehouse, near the sealed loading dock. Miles looked back. The man in the jumpsuit was standing there, in the cone of the light, completely still. But now, he wasn't alone. Floating slightly above the ground, beside him, was the faint, transparent, yet distinctly shaped silhouette of a small child, holding the source of the high-pitched giggle. The ghostly child was clutching something small and wooden. It was the spinning top from the collection. The man in the jumpsuit raised his rusted hook, a silent signal. The light snapped off, plunging the warehouse into absolute darkness once again. Miles grabbed the push bar and shoved with all his weight. The door didn't budge. He shoved again, harder. Nothing. It's locked from the outside. Kay cried, her voice laced with panic. The push bar won't work. Miles stepped back, pulling out a small, powerful breaching charge he always kept for emergencies. Stand clear, Kay. We're going loud. But before he could apply the charge, the heavy, rusted metal of the door began to bow inward, slowly, inexorably, as if pushed by an incredible, unseen weight. The metal shrieked in protest. Whatever was on the outside was trying to get in, and it wasn't the police backup. They were caught between two forces. The fire exit door was shrieking, a high, tearing metal sound as it buckled inward under immense, external pressure. Miles pressed his back against the nearest steel column, pulling Kay with him, the breaching charge forgotten in his hand. Move! Now! Miles yelled over the grinding metal. They abandoned the exit and scrambled back toward the center of the warehouse, their flashlights bouncing wildly off the concrete and beams. The steel door gave with a final, horrible crack and tore free from its hinges, flying inward with a deafening crash and landing right where they had been standing seconds before. A blast of cold, damp air rushed in, carrying the scent of tidal marsh and decay. Miles dared a quick glance back. Standing in the gap where the door had been was not the man in the jumpsuit, but a massive, indistinct shape, something heavy, low, and breathing with a wet, ragged sound. It was too dark and too fast for them to get a clear visual, but the raw, animal aggression emanating from it was palpable. It split up. Miles realized. The man is inside, and something else is outside, driving us. They ran past the victim's body and the arrangement of objects, heading toward a far corner where the floor looked strangely uneven. They could hear the heavy, scraping sound of the second entity entering the building behind them. "Look, a hatch." Kay pointed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Tucked beneath a dusty, discarded tarp was a square steel hatch set into the concrete floor, secured by two heavy, sliding bolt locks. Miles dropped to his knees, his hands fumbling desperately with the bolts. They were rusted shut. He slammed the heel of his boot against them repeatedly until one groaned and finally slid open. He moved to the second bolt just as the chilling, high-pitched giggle echoed from somewhere above them again. "You can't hide," the small, ghostly voice seemed to sing. Miles got the second bolt open. He grabbed the recessed handle and pulled. The hatch resisted, then burst open with a cloud of dust and the stench of sewer gas and old machinery. A rusted ladder led down into a pitch-black abyss. "Go, Kay. Go." Miles pushed her toward the hole. Kay disappeared down the ladder without hesitation. Miles paused just long enough to activate the timer on his tactical stun grenade and toss it in the direction of the huge, scraping noise that he dropped through the hatch, slamming the steel cover shut just as the stun grenade detonated with a blinding flash and a deafening crack that shook the entire floor above them. Miles slid down the rusty rungs, landing heavily on a cold, wet concrete floor beside Kay. He immediately pulled out his light. They were in a low-ceilinged sub-level, a damp, cramped service tunnel running beneath the main warehouse floor. Rusted pipes lined the ceiling, dripping cold water, and the air here was intensely cold and utterly silent. "What was that thing outside?" Kay whispered, shining her light back up the ladder toward the hatch. The force of the explosion had muffled the entity, but Miles knew it wouldn't be for long. "I don't know," Miles admitted, breathing hard. "But it was heavier and slower than the man. They are working together." Miles swept his light around the tunnel. It was unnervingly clean for a service area in a derelict building. The floor was concrete, but in several places, circular depressions had been cut out, perfectly spaced. "Look," Miles said, pointing his light at the nearest depression. It was exactly the size of the circular patches of blood they had seen on the floor above, the ones that formed the terrifying geometric symbol. "The symbol," Kay breathed. "Those three circles. They aren't just drawn on the floor. They are marks of something that happened here." Miles moved quickly to the next circular depression. This one was larger than the first. He knelt, shining his light into the indentation. The edges of the concrete were scarred and chipped, as if something massive had been bolted there for decades and recently removed. Then, Miles saw it. Etched faintly into the concrete. Within the circle, barely visible beneath the grime, was a single, tiny, faded bird feather outline. "The white feather," Miles said, his voice flat. "It's the symbol." The man above placed a feather on the victim's chest to complete a ritual here, in this spot. He looked at the series of indentations in the floor of the tunnel, which mirrored the arrangement of the victim's belongings above. "This entire building is the template, Kay," Miles concluded, standing up slowly. "The arrangements, the objects, the killings, they are all tied to specific points in this sub-level structure. They are using the building itself as part of their ritual." As he finished the sentence, a heavy, dragging sound started directly above their heads, the sound of something large and cumbersome being pulled across the floor of the warehouse. It was moving quickly, scraping against the metal of the pipes that ran along the tunnel's ceiling. The sounds converged directly over them, and then stopped. Miles instinctively looked up at the rusted pipes, now inches from his head. Suddenly, a thick, dark, viscous stream of the same fluid they had seen above erupted from a severed pipe joint directly above them, splattering Miles's face and flashlight lens. The liquid was warm, heavy, and smelled overpoweringly of iron and formaldehyde. Miles instinctively stumbled back, wiping his face frantically. Then, from the darkness just ahead in the tunnel, a new sound emerged, a rapid, high-pitched series of clicks and clacks, like hundreds of tiny joints snapping into place, followed by a low, guttural chittering. Miles and Kay aimed their lights toward the sound, their hearts sinking. The tunnel didn't end ahead. It opened into a cavernous, pitch-black space, and from the darkness, two small, luminous, yellow eyes blinked open, instantly fixed on their position. Whatever was in the tunnel with them was small, fast, and now fully aware of their exact location. The yellow eyes belonged to something small and agile. As Miles and Kay trained their flashlights on the source of the chittering and clicking, the light revealed not one creature, but several, a swarm of things scuttling towards them with alarming speed along the wet concrete floor. They were roughly the size of large house cats, but their bodies were disturbingly angular and covered in a chitinous, dark exoskeleton that shone sleekly in the light. They moved with a disturbing, sideways skitter, their many-jointed legs clicking rapidly against the floor. "Not going in the deep end, Miles," Kay yelled, firing her pistol instinctively. The sharp crack of the gunshot echoed deafeningly in the cramped tunnel. The bullet slammed into the concrete near the swarm, sending up sparks and dust, but the creatures barely reacted, simply surging forward, their movements erratic and impossible to track clearly. Miles drew his own weapon. "Back up. Back up." They retreated quickly down the tunnel, the swarm rapidly closing the distance, their chittering growing into a high-pitched, furious noise. The creatures seemed immune to the fear of the gunshots. Driven by a singular, primal urge, Miles fired 3 controlled shots, aiming for the center of the approaching mass. 2 of the creatures went down, emitting a sickening crunch and spraying a thick, oily fluid onto the floor, but the others simply scrambled over the bodies and continued their charge. "They're too fast. There are too many," Kay cried, backing up until she hit a dead end, a wall of corroded, locked metal doors. Miles glanced over his shoulder. The doors were marked with a faded, rusted sign, "Hazardous Waste Storage, Do Not Enter." "We have to get through the door." Miles aimed his pistol at the lock mechanism, but he knew the thick metal wouldn't yield easily. The swarm was only feet away now. Their clicking noise was a wall of sound, and the stench of decay and something chemical was overpowering. Just as the first creature leapt into the air, Miles saw a subtle detail in the wall. Beside the storage doors was a ventilation shaft, covered by a flimsy, rusted grate. "The vent." "Kay, move." Miles grabbed the grate, ignoring the pain as the rusty metal sliced into his hand. He kicked at the corroded base and tore the grate free. They squeezed into the narrow, dark vent shaft just as the swarm of creatures slammed into the metal door behind them with terrifying force, scrambling and clicking, trying to force their way into the small opening. The air in the shaft was choked with dust and felt unnaturally hot. Miles and Kay crawled forward, Miles leading, pushing through the suffocating darkness for what felt like an eternity. After several agonizing minutes, the shaft ended abruptly, dropping into an open space. Miles kicked out the fragile vent cover and lowered himself down, his feet landing on a floor that was sticky and uneven. He shined his light around. They were in a much larger, circular room beneath the storage area. This place was different. The walls were lined with old, pitted ceramic tiles, and the air hummed with a low, barely audible mechanical sound. The center of the room was dominated by a huge, gaping hole, a circular, iron-lined pit about 20 feet across, descending into impenetrable blackness. The floor surrounding the pit was stained black and smelled heavily of sulfur and burned meat. As Miles approached the edge, his light catching the sheer drop, Kay let out a horrified gasp. Lining the circumference of the pit, bolted into the iron rim, was a grotesque series of items. Not personal effects this time, but bones. Human bones. They weren't randomized. Each segment, a rib cage, a collection of vertebrae, a perfectly preserved skull, was carefully attached to the metal, arranged like macabre carvings on a demonic altar. And each section was marked by a single, small, rusted metal tag. Miles shone his light directly onto the nearest skull. The tag tied around its mandible was engraved with the name S. Croft. Samuel Croft, Miles whispered, stepping back. The fisherman from 1978. The one whose wallet was upstairs. He realized the horrific truth, the items upstairs were just tokens. This pit was the final destination. This circular chamber, deep beneath the Northstar Logistics building, was not a place of storage, but a place of ritual. Miles backed away, his gaze sweeping over the ring of bones, a timeline of the entity's history in Havenwood. Suddenly, the mechanical humming in the room grew louder, intensifying to a low, powerful drone. The air pressure dropped, and Miles felt a profound, physical chill. Then, from the absolute blackness of the pit, a deep, inhuman grinding sound began, followed by the slow, painful squeal of heavy, rusted chains being cranked upwards. Something was coming up from the bottom of the pit. Miles grabbed Kay's arm. "We have to leave. Now. We've seen too much. This is beyond us." They moved toward a single, heavy steel door marked simply with an arrow pointing up and the word exit. Miles applied the breaching charge he still held, setting the fuse. As he backed away, the grinding sound from the pit reached a fever pitch. A dark, impossibly tall shadow began to rise out of the hole, blotting out the light from above, filling the room with a cold that made the air burn in their lungs. The breaching charge detonated with a sharp, concussive blast, tearing the steel exit door from its frame. Miles and Kay dove through the opening, just as the final, horrifying shape of the thing rising from the pit was momentarily illuminated by the blast fading flash, a massive, gaunt torso of twisted, scarred flesh and metal. Covered in the same dark, oily fluid as the swarm, they scrambled up a steep flight of concrete stairs, kicking the damaged exit door shut behind them just as the massive entity emitted a sound that wasn't a growl or a roar, but a deep, resonating bell-like chime that pulsed through the concrete and into their bones, promising absolute, final terror. Miles and Kay burst through the final exterior door, a small, nondescript service exit on the north side of the Northstar building, and stumbled out into the cold, clear pre-dawn air. They were disoriented, covered in grime, blood, and the oily fluid from the sublevel, but they were outside. The sight that greeted them was a chaotic blend of relief and immediate danger. 3 patrol cruisers were parked haphazardly near the main entrance, their blue and red lights painting the industrial yard in frantic, strobing colors. Backup had arrived. Officer Ben Hayes, a solid, veteran patrolman, and 2 younger officers, Chen and Diaz, were approaching the main loading dock with shotguns drawn, having seen the violently sealed door and the initial evidence of the breach. "Hayes! Stop!" Miles screamed, his voice raw, waving his arms frantically. He and Kay ran toward them, pistols still drawn. "Don't go near the main dock. The whole building is a trap." Hayes, recognizing Miles's authoritative tone and the sheer terror on his face, immediately raised a hand to halt his team. "Corbin. Sharma. What the hell happened to you two? Where's the suspect?" Before Miles could even formulate a coherent answer about the man in the jumpsuit, the swarm, or the monstrosity in the pit, the Northstar building itself seemed to erupt. The enormous, rusted loading dock door that Miles and Kay had first approached suddenly shuddered inward with devastating force, blowing out the upper hinges and tearing the metal frame. Standing in the newly formed, colossal gap was the creature they had only glimpsed in the underground. The pit thing. It was impossibly large. Towering over the patrol cars, a grotesque fusion of scarred, pale flesh and rusted, industrial metal, parts of the sub-level infrastructure seemingly merged with a living body. Its arms were vast and ended in heavy, blunt hooks, and its movement was accompanied by the sound of grinding gears and wet, sickening sloshing. It emitted another of those deep, resonant, bell-like chimes, a sound that was both an auditory blast and a physical shockwave. The veteran Officer Hayes froze, his shotgun wavering, staring at the sight of the entity that defied every law of physics and nature. "Oh, God," Hayes whispered, the reality of the situation slamming into him. Miles, driven by pure instinct, threw himself and Kay behind the nearest cruiser. "Open fire. Shoot for the head." Hayes and the 2 other officers reacted immediately, emptying their shotguns into the massive torso of the pit thing. The blasts were deafening. Pellets struck the pale, oily flesh and the rusted metal plates covering its body, but the creature didn't flinch. The force of the hits barely registered as tiny puffs of debris. Instead, The pit thing slowly raised one of its massive, hooked arms and, with deliberate, casual force, brought the hook down onto the roof of the nearest police cruiser. The impact was horrific, a sound of tearing metal and glass shattering into thousands of pieces. The cruiser crumpled like a soda can, its lights dying instantly. Shen and Diaz, seeing the impossible resilience of the creature, scrambled to reload, their training momentarily overridden by panic, but the pit thing wasn't finished. From the darkness of the ruined loading dock behind it, the man in the jumpsuit emerged. He was holding the long, rusted metal hook and was moving with chilling, unnatural focus. He wasn't attacking the pit thing, he was heading straight for the remaining officers. "Miles!" "The man!" Kay shouted, aiming her pistol at the approaching figure. The man in the jumpsuit moved with a blurring, skipping gait, ignoring the hail of bullets meant for the larger creature. He reached Hayes before the veteran officer could even chamber another shell. There was a sickening, wet crunch. The man's rusted hook plunged deep into Hayes' shoulder, not stopping the initial attack, but instead pulling Hayes away from his cover and out into the open, a sacrifice being dragged to the feet of the massive entity. "No!" Miles roared, snapping off two quick shots. One bullet struck the jumpsuit man in the chest, but he didn't even stumble. He just turned his head slightly, his milky white eyes briefly locking onto Miles in a blank, terrifying stare. The massive pit thing raised its other arm, ready to crush Hayes, who was now screaming in agony on the asphalt. Miles knew he couldn't save Hayes. He had to stop the entity. He saw the perfect, insane opportunity. On the far side of the building, where the fire exit had been violently torn out, the dark shape of the marsh creature must have retreated, but the door remained torn. "Kay! Distract the large one. Focus on the eyes!" Miles yelled, scrambling out from behind the cruiser, now ignoring the man in the jumpsuit and the massive creature. He sprinted toward the corner of the building. "Miles, where are you going?" Kay shouted, firing a desperate round towards the massive entity's head. "I'm going to collapse the foundation." Miles reached the torn fire exit. He looked inside, the air thick with the smell of sulfur and decay. He could hear the faint, low hum of the ceremonial pit below, ignoring the metallic smell of the blood now dripping freely from his own cuts. Miles threw his entire remaining supply of breaching charges, 3 large blocks, deep into the sub-level stairwell they had just climbed out of, aiming for the area near the foundation columns. He didn't bother with the timer. He crossed the contacts, creating an instant, massive short circuit. Miles ran for his life, throwing himself to the ground just as the charges detonated. The explosion wasn't a sharp blast like the grenade. It was a terrifying, earth-shaking boom that came from deep within the earth. The sound of rending concrete and bending steel ripped through the night. The ground shuddered violently beneath the industrial yard. The Northstar building, having stood derelict for years, groaned like a dying beast. The pit thing, distracted by the colossal structural failure, emitted a final, high-pitched scream, not a chime, but a roar of pure, mechanical pain. Its huge, metal-fused body staggered backward, pulling the man in the jumpsuit and the grievously wounded Hayes back into the gaping maw of the collapsing building. The entire structure began to implode on itself, a massive, deafening cascade of falling concrete, twisted girders, and ancient machinery, swallowed by the collapsing sub-level. When the dust finally settled, all that remained of Northstar Logistics was a huge, smoking crater. Silence returned to Havenwood, heavy and absolute. The police lights continued to flash across the ruined landscape, illuminating only dust, debris, and the sheer, overwhelming devastation. Miles pushed himself up, his ears ringing, his body aching, and looked across the rubble at Kay, who was staring back in stunned silence. They had survived. But the threat wasn't over. Miles knew, with a sick certainty, that the thing in the pit had only been temporarily cleansed. He looked down at the palm of his hand, where the rusty grate had cut him. He saw something on the back of his hand, a small, dark smudge that he hadn't noticed before. It was the chilling, geometric design of the 3 overlapping circles, now crudely branded into his skin by the oily, hot fluid that had dripped on him in the tunnel. He was marked. And the ritual was incomplete. The sunrise painted the enormous crater in the industrial park with shades of blood orange and sickly yellow. The air still hung thick with the acrid smell of ozone, pulverized concrete, and decay. Miles and Kay were the only uninjured survivors. Officer Hayes was gone, swallowed by the collapse, along with the two monstrous entities, the pit thing and the man in the jumpsuit. Officers Chen and Diaz were treated for shock and minor shrapnel wounds. Their testimonies about the massive, metal-covered lunatic and the unbelievable size of the beast, instantly dismissed by arriving command staff as trauma-induced hallucinations. Captain David Vance, Miles's direct supervisor, a man known for his rigid adherence to procedure and fear of media scrutiny, arrived on the scene looking like he was about to burst a blood vessel. Miles was immediately taken aside. He sat in the back of an ambulance, shivering despite the heat, while a paramedic cleaned the cuts on his hands and face. Corbin, Vance spat, leaning into the ambulance, his voice dangerously low. "What in God's name did you do? A building the size of Northstar doesn't just spontaneously implode. 3 officers are dead or missing, and you're telling me you were attacked by a ghost and a man made of machinery." Miles stared at the captain, exhausted, the image of the branded circles on his hand burning under the antiseptic wipe. "Sir, we were attacked by 2 hostile entities," Miles insisted, his voice hoarse. "They were operating a ritualistic killing site in the sublevels. I used the breaching charges to collapse the unstable foundation directly under that site. It was the only way to stop them and save Kay and the 2 other officers." Vance coughed, running a hand over his bald head. "Ritualistic killing? Miles, we found no bodies besides the one victim you reported, a known vagrant with a deep throat wound. The man in the jumpsuit. He's probably an escaped mental patient high on bath salts who was caught in the blast. The rest, the pit thing, is nonsense." "It's not nonsense, Captain. We found evidence of decades of disappearances down there, bones, ritualistic markings. Hayes is gone, sir. Don't let his death be for nothing." Vance's expression hardened. "The official report will state the victim was killed by a psychotic squatter who used volatile industrial chemicals and explosives to booby-trap the building, resulting in a catastrophic structural failure when he was confronted. End of discussion." He fixed Miles with a steely glare. "You will back up that narrative, Miles. We seal this off, we clean the site, and Havenwood remains a quiet town. Is that understood? For your career, and frankly, for your sanity." Miles understood the drill. The truth was too terrifying, too disruptive. He nodded slowly, his eyes dropping to his hand. The paramedic had finished cleaning the cut. Miles looked at the back of his hand. The skin was slightly swollen, but the crude scar of the 3 overlapping circles was undeniable, burned into his flesh. The mark. He quickly pulled down his sleeve to hide it from Vance. Later that afternoon, after giving a highly sanitized version of events to a detective, omitting the pit, the sub-level symbols, and the swarm, Miles found Kay staring out the window of the precinct's break room, nursing a cup of tea. She looked pale and fragile. "Did you tell them everything?" Kay asked without turning around. "No," Miles admitted, sitting down beside her. "I told them the sanitized version. Squatter, explosives, collapse." Vance shut it down fast. Kay finally turned, her eyes hollow. "They'll never believe us, Miles. They didn't even go down to the pit." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But I know what I saw. I saw the mark in the blood, Miles. I saw the bones, the timeline. That thing, it was feeding on the history of this town." Miles reached out and squeezed her arm. "We know the truth. And we are going to find out what those circles mean." That night, Miles lay in his cramped apartment, the adrenaline crash replaced by a paralyzing sense of dread. He couldn't sleep. The image of the pit thing's massive, metal-fused body rising from the darkness was burned behind his eyelids. He finally pulled back his sleeve and examined the scar. It was raised, red, and tender. As he touched it, a wave of profound, unnatural cold washed over his arm, making the hair stand up. Then, he heard it, a sound that shouldn't be possible outside his window on the 3rd floor. Plop, the wet, rhythmic splatter. Miles shot out of bed, grabbing his off-duty piece. He cautiously approached his window and pulled back the curtain. There was a light drizzle outside, but the sound wasn't the uniform drumming of rain. It was the same, distinct, heavy plop. Once every 3 seconds Miles looked down to the rain-slick pavement 3 stories below. Nothing. He scanned the buildings across the street. Emptied. Plop. He looked up. And there it was, perched silently on the rain gutter directly above his window was a single white bird. It wasn't moving, just sitting perfectly still, and from its beak, instead of water, a thick, dark, viscous drop was falling onto the windowsill. The drops were the color and consistency of the blood they had seen in the Northstar warehouse. Plop. The bird shifted its head, and its eyes, tiny black beads, locked onto Miles's own through the glass. It stayed there, silently watching him, its presence a cold, undeniable confirmation. The mark on his hand throbbed. He realized with chilling clarity that the entity hadn't been defeated, it had simply been displaced. And now, it knew exactly where he lived. Miles slammed the curtain shut, the image of the silent, dark dripping white bird searing itself into his memory. He backed away from the window, heart hammering against his ribs, until his back hit the cold wall. The plop continued for several terrifying minutes, directly outside his window, before the rhythmic sound suddenly ceased, replaced by a flapping of wings and silence. He stayed by the wall, weapon raised, until the first weak light of dawn filtered through the apartment. He didn't sleep. The next morning, Miles showed up to work, pale and running on sheer terror. He pulled Kay aside in the precinct garage. "It's not over, Kay," Miles said, his voice flat. He pulled up his sleeve, showing her the ugly, circular scar on his hand. "I got marked. And it found me last night." Kay stared at the brand, then back at Miles's wide, exhausted eyes. "The symbol, the 3 circles. It branded you with its signature." "Why?" "I think it's a beacon," Miles whispered, dropping his voice lower as a patrolman walked past. "The entity wasn't eliminated, it was just sealed underground. And now, it's tracking me." Miles spent the morning sequestered in a dusty, seldom used records room, pulling microfiche of old Havenwood artifacts and local history, desperate to find the meaning of the 3 circles. Kay was at the station, running background checks on the known victims the department had identified. Hours passed, filled with the scratching sound of the microfiche reader. Miles went through shipbuilding blueprints, old church records, and even ancient property deeds for the Northstar Industrial Park. Finally, in a local historical society's archive detailing the founding of Havenwood in the late 17th century, Miles found a match. It wasn't a symbol of a cult or a gang. It was an arcane, almost forgotten surveyor's mark. The text was brittle and written in archaic English. Upon the laying of the town square, 3 sacred plots were marked by the seal of the watchers to be kept forever virgin, lest the deep gate be disturbed. No building upon the 3 circles. Miles stared, jaw slack. The description wasn't just of 3 circles, it was the exact pattern of the symbol on his hand. He scrambled to find the map referenced in the text. When he finally located the ancient parchment, his blood ran cold. The 3 overlapping circles, the seal of the watchers, marked a specific geometric point, a massive, inverted triangle connecting 3 points in Havenwood. Circle 1, the former site of Northstar Logistics, where the pit was. Circle 2, the ancient lighthouse on Widow's Peak, overlooking the harbor. Circle 3, the Havenwood Central Police Precinct. Miles felt a dizzying wave of nausea. The symbol on his hand wasn't just a signature, it was the map. He hadn't just survived the ritual, he had become the new, mobile marker for the 3rd, and most critical, point of the entity's ritualistic map. He slammed the microfiche reader shut and raced out to find Kay, his heart pounding a frantic warning. He found her in the bullpen, hunched over her desk, her hand clamped over the receiver of her phone. She looked sick. "Kay, we have to go. The pit thing is connected to the foundation of the precinct." "It's the 3rd point," Kay cut him off, hanging up the phone, her eyes fixed on something across the room. "Miles, listen to me. I was running background checks on the last known victim, the vagrant from last night. His name was Leo Vance." Miles frowned. "Vance? Like the captain?" Kay nodded slowly, her expression grim. "He was Captain Vance's estranged younger brother. Disappeared about 6 months ago, known for substance abuse. The captain covered it up, treated it as a runaway. Wait, so the victim was related to the captain? Miles's mind reeled. Why would the entity target the captain's brother? I don't know, Kay said, her voice shaking slightly, but that's not the worst of it. The call I just got. It was the desk sergeant. Captain Vance hasn't shown up for his morning meeting, and he's not answering his phone. His car is still in the parking garage, right where the third circle of the Watchers is located on the basement map. Miles felt the unnatural, icy coldness of the brand on his hand intensify, throbbing rhythmically, like a heartbeat that wasn't his own. The entity was moving to complete its ritual, and it was targeting the people Miles had reported to, the people who had tried to bury the truth. The man in the jumpsuit, Miles muttered, realizing the chilling logic. He's the agent. He got out of the collapse. He was marking the spots. And now he's finishing the pattern. They both looked toward the elevator doors leading down to the basement parking garage, the exact spot of the third sacred plot. Miles pulled his pistol, his jaw set. He's in the basement. He's trying to make the precinct the next Northstar. We go in together. No backup. No lights. We hit him before he can finish the arrangement. As they reached the elevator, they heard a faint, familiar sound emanating from the locked basement doors, a slow, deliberate, heavy sound. Plop, the final ritual was underway. Miles and Kay abandoned the slow elevator and slammed through the heavy steel door leading to the emergency stairwell. The air in the stairwell was immediately colder, thick with the metallic scent of old oil and something sharp, the scent of the Northstar sublevel. They descended into the precinct basement parking garage, a vast, echoing space usually filled with the mundane reality of police work. Now, it was a tomb of shadows and oppressive silence. They moved cautiously, Miles leading, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The rhythmic plop was now loud and clear, echoing off the concrete columns. It was coming from the center of the garage, the marked location of the third circle of the Watchers. Miles stopped behind a thick concrete column, pulling Kay close. He's here. He's working. Stay low. They crept forward, their hearts hammering against the silence. Miles's flashlight beam illuminated a chilling scene in the center of the garage. Captain David Vance was there, but he wasn't gone. He was arranged that he was propped against the pillar marked P3, sitting bolt upright, eyes wide in a silent horror that mirrored the victim at Northstar. His throat was savagely cut, mirroring the gruesome work of the rusted hook. Kneeling before the body was the man in the jumpsuit. He was meticulously using his long, bony fingers to apply the dark, viscous fluid from his hook, the same fluid dripping from above, to the concrete floor, completing the final arc of the three-circle symbol. Miles saw the final, chilling detail. Resting on Captain Vance's chest was not a single white feather, but a small, tarnished silver locket, the same locket from the collection at Northstar, but freshly placed. He's cycling the symbols, Kay whispered, her voice barely a thread. The locket was for the victim from the 50s. He's moving the markers. Miles realized the implication that the ritual wasn't about the victims, it was about the items. The items were being used to anchor the points of the ritual. Now! Miles shouted, leaping out from behind the pillar, his pistol raised. Police! Drop the hook. The man in the jumpsuit didn't jump or run. He simply raised his empty, milky white eyes toward Miles. His face remained chillingly blank, devoid of any human emotion, yet his posture radiated malevolent satisfaction. He slowly stood up, letting the rusted hook drop. It landed on the concrete with a heavy clank. Miles aimed for the head. Don't move. Hands up. The man raised his hands, those horribly elongated, skeletal hands, but instead of surrendering, he did something utterly unexpected. He clapped once, sharply, in the vast silence of the garage. The sound was instantly followed by the high-pitched, mocking giggle of the ghostly child from Northstar, and then, from every shadow in the precinct basement, the clicking and chittering began. The swarm. They poured out from under parked vehicles, from behind utility boxes, and through drainage grates. Hundreds of the small, angular, chitinous creatures, rapidly closing the distance, drawn by the man's signal. Kay, cover me. Aim low. Miles yelled, opening fire on the man in the jumpsuit. knowing he had to stop the source of the chaos. Miles's bullets struck the man square in the chest. Instead of blood, a puff of dark, metallic dust erupted from the impact point, and the man lurched backward, but did not fall. He merely grinned at a wide, sickeningly stretched expression that finally broke his blank facade. Kay fired rapidly into the advancing swarm, the creatures scattering and clicking furiously, but refusing to retreat. The man in the jumpsuit turned and sprinted toward the freight elevator at the far end of the garage with the same impossible, shuffling speed they had seen at Northstar. "He's getting away!" Kay shouted, reloading frantically. "Let him!" Miles yelled back, firing his last 2 shots into the dense swarm, momentarily slowing them. "We can't fight them all. We need to get out of the precinct. Now!" They turned and ran back toward the emergency stairwell, the frantic clicking of the swarm close behind them. As they raced past Captain Vance's corpse, Miles's eyes locked onto the silver locket resting on the captain's chest. He paused for a crucial half-second, driven by an insane, desperate thought. The item anchors the ritual. Miles snatched the locket from the dead man's chest. The moment his fingers closed around the cold, tarnished silver, the furious chittering of the swarm behind them instantly ceased. Miles looked back. The creatures were frozen, scattered across the garage floor, motionless as statues. The silence returned, heavy and absolute. What happened?" Kay breathed, spinning around, her gun trained on the still, silent creatures. Miles stared at the locket in his hand. The minute he touched it, the pulsing, cold sensation on his branded hand had vanished, replaced by an unsettling warmth. "The item," Miles gasped, running toward the stairs. "The ritual is about the mark and the items. When I took the locket, I broke the connection to the 3rd point." They scrambled back up the stairs, 2 at a time, Miles clutching the locket, the current anchor of the entity's ritualistic map. They burst out of the stairwell and back into the normal chaos of the precinct bullpen. Miles looked down at his hand. The scar, the 3 overlapping circles, was now glowing faintly with a pulsing, internal light. The man in the jumpsuit was gone, having vanished up the freight elevator. But Miles now held the key to the entity's movements. He had become the unwilling keeper of the ritual's anchor. Miles and Kay locked themselves in the precinct chief's vacant office, barricading the door with a heavy filing cabinet. The locket, clutched tightly in Miles's hand, felt oddly warm, radiating a faint, almost imperceptible tremor. The precinct was already in lockdown. Sirens wailed outside as backup arrived, but no one dared go down to the basement, already reporting strange smells and sounds. The official cover story was already being circulated: an industrial gas leak and a tragic double murder by a deranged homeless man. Miles dumped the contents of the locket onto the desk, a tiny, yellowed photograph of a young woman with a kind smile, and a tightly folded piece of paper. "The entity wants the ritual completed, and the items are the key," Miles concluded, rubbing the glowing scar on his hand. "When I took the locket, I disrupted the ritual cycle, but I also tied the anchor to myself." Kay carefully unfolded the tiny slip of paper from inside the locket. It was handwritten, decades old, F.H. 1957. "Widow's Peak." Kay gasped. F.H. is the woman in the photo. And Widow's Peak, that's the location of the lighthouse. The 2nd circle of the Watchers. Miles pulled out the ancient surveyor's map of the 3 circles. Northstar was Circle 1. The precinct was Circle 3. The lighthouse on Widow's Peak is Circle 2. He slammed his fist on the desk. "The items are organized by age and position. Locket for the 1957 disappearance. Wallet for 1978. Spinning top for the oldest disappearance, probably 1920s. Miles's eyes widened with a terrifying realization. The man in the jumpsuit, the agent, he's not just arranging the victims, he's moving the items to their designated, original spots to complete the 3-point seal. He dropped the locket at the precinct, the 3rd point, and when I took it, I stopped him. So, what's left?" Kay pressed, her face tight with dread. "The final, oldest item," Miles said, his voice grim. "The tiny, wooden spinning top. It belongs at the lighthouse, Circle 2. If he places it there, the seal is complete, and whatever is in that pit will be fully unleashed. He checked the time. The sun was fully up, but the shadows still seemed to cling to the corners of the office. We have to get to the lighthouse before he does. We have to find that spinning top and make sure it never reaches Widow's Peak. They slipped out of the precinct through the back exit, driving Kay's unmarked vehicle out into the city. Miles kept the locket wrapped tightly in his fist, the warmth of the silver a constant, unnerving presence. As they drove toward the coast, the air over the city felt strangely muted, the colors too sharp, the silence between traffic noises too pronounced. They reached the top of Widow's Peak, a rocky, windswept promontory overlooking the gray expanse of the Atlantic. The Havenwood lighthouse stood sentinel, a massive, lonely white column, its lamp dark in the daylight. They found the agent of the ritual waiting for them. The man in the jumpsuit was standing on the narrow, stone walkway leading up to the lighthouse door. He was entirely still, facing the ocean, but his milky white eyes were aimed squarely at their approaching car, and in his unnaturally long, skeletal fingers, he was holding the tiny, wooden spinning top. "He was waiting for us," Kay whispered, pulling the car to a halt behind a storage shed. "He knows we have the locket. He wants to trade." "No trade," Miles stated, pulling his rifle from the trunk. "He knows the locket is the anchor. He's putting the final piece in place. If that top touches the lighthouse ground, the ritual is complete. We take him out before he can move." They moved around the shed, using the uneven terrain for cover. The wind howled around the lighthouse, making it difficult to hear anything else. Miles raised his rifle, sighting the blank, pale face of the man. Just as Miles was about to pull the trigger, the man moved. Not toward them, but toward the base of the lighthouse tower. He slowly knelt down, his gaze still fixed on Miles. He placed the wooden spinning top gently on the mossy, ancient stones at the base of the tower. He smiled that sickening, stretched, inhuman grin one last time. Then, he stood up, raised his hands above his head, and let out a chilling, drawn-out wail that was instantly snatched away by the wind, a sound of finality and triumph. The moment the spinning top settled on the ground, the glowing scar on Miles's hand went cold, not the immediate, icy cold of fear, but a deep, profound chill of dread. The locket dropped from his numb fingers. The man in the jumpsuit turned and ran, not toward the road, but straight for the steep, rocky cliff face overlooking the turbulent ocean. He threw himself over the edge and was swallowed instantly by the fog and the raging surf below. Miles and Kay stared at the spot where the man vanished. Then, the lighthouse began to respond. The huge, central lamp, which should have been dormant, suddenly roared to life. It wasn't the rhythmic, sweeping beam of a navigational light. It was a single, static column of blinding, yellowish-green light that shot straight up into the gray sky, puncturing the low clouds. A terrifying sound began to emanate from the ground itself, a deep, resonant, bell-like chime that was not coming from the collapsed pit, but from everywhere at once. The entire earth beneath Widow's Peak seemed to vibrate. Miles realized the horrific implications. The 3 circles were sealed. The ritual was complete, and whatever had been contained beneath Havenwood was now using the lighthouse as its enormous, terrifying beacon. The bell-like chime resonated through Miles and Kay, vibrating in their teeth and bones. The ancient stones of Widow's Peak hummed with raw, terrifying energy, focused and amplified by the single, blinding column of yellowish-green light erupting from the lighthouse lamp. Miles looked down at his hand. The scar was now cold and dull. The ritual was complete. "It's not a signal, Kay," Miles gasped, shielding his eyes from the intense light. "It's an opening. The lighthouse isn't a beacon, it's a gate." He grabbed Kay's arm. "We have to get to the top. We have to destroy the light. That's the key to the seal." They raced toward the heavy, iron-bound door of the lighthouse tower. It was locked, but Miles, driven by sheer terror and desperation, used his last remaining breaching charge on the deadbolt. The door blew inward with a splintering crash. They rushed up the tight, winding metal staircase. The air inside was searing hot, smelling of burnt oil and sulfur, the intense light from above casting dizzying, spinning shadows. As they ascended, they passed windows that offered brief, terrifying views of the consequences of the completed seal. Out over the harbor, the water was churning violently, unnatural whirlpools forming rapidly, accompanied by the sight of dark, impossibly shaped things breaking the surface, small, angular creatures mirroring the swarm. The entire coastline of Havenwood was being submerged in chaos. Finally, they reached the narrow lamp chamber at the top. The immense glass housing was vibrating, radiating punishing heat. In the center, the blinding lamp fixture pulsed violently, feeding the towering light beam aimed at the sky, but the chamber wasn't empty. The man in the jumpsuit was waiting for them. He hadn't jumped to his death, he had used the cliff dive as a feint, utilizing the subterranean tunnels to reach the final, crucial point. He was standing directly beside the lamp, his hands resting on the huge, exposed crystal lenses. Too late, the man's voice rasped, devoid of triumph, merely stating a fact. The Watchers have opened the deep gate. You are marked. You are bound. Miles, exhausted and furious, raised his rifle and fired. The bullet struck the man's shoulder, sending a shower of metallic dust and sparks. This time, the man reacted with a spasm of pain, lurching away from the lamp. "Kay, the lamp. Shoot the lamp!" Miles yelled, focusing his fire on the man, forcing him to keep his distance. Kay raised her pistol and fired several rounds at the massive lens housing. The glass was thick, designed to withstand storms, and the bullets simply chipped the surface, deflecting off with high-pitched ricochets. The man in the jumpsuit recovered, his milky eyes fixed on Miles. He didn't run. He lunged, not with the hook, but with his terrifyingly long, strong hands, closing the distance in a horrifying blur. Miles dropped his rifle, pulling his pistol, but it was too late. The man's hands clamped around Miles's throat. His grip was immense, powered by inhuman strength. Miles felt the life drain from him, his vision blurry. He was pinned against the metal wall, the agonizing heat of the lamp fixture inches from his head. "The anchor is complete," the man rasped directly into Miles's ear, his breath hot and fetid. "The pit is empty. The town is there." As the darkness started to creep into Miles's vision, he glanced down at his hand, the marked hand. The three overlapping circles were faintly glowing again, drawing strength from the proximity of the gate. He saw the discarded locket, the current anchor, lying on the floor. And then he saw the discarded piece of evidence that had started this entire nightmare, the single white feather they had seen at the first victim's location. The entity's signature. A sudden, insane realization hit Miles. The ritual wasn't about the victims or the symbols, it was about the disruption. The items were anchors. Miles kicked out wildly, forcing the man's grip to loosen momentarily. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, Miles snatched the single white feather from the floor. He brought the feather up and, with his thumb, fiercely pressed the sharp quill end directly onto the glowing, sensitive scar on the back of his hand. "The seal of the Watchers," Miles screamed, a raw, guttural sound of agony as the quill punctured his flesh. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The glowing scar on Miles's hand flared with impossible, blinding white light. The light was channeled into the feather, creating a momentary, focused surge of energy that was not of the entity, but of the seal itself. The man in the jumpsuit shrieked, a deafening sound of pure, raw pain and terror. He threw himself off Miles, clutching his head, his body dissolving into a cloud of dark, oily dust and metallic fragments that scattered instantly on the floor. Miles stumbled back, his arm throbbing, his vision clearing. He looked at the lamp. The massive, yellowish-green beam shooting into the sky wavered, its pulse slowing down to a sputtering, frantic flicker. The bell-like chime ceased, replaced by a horrible, retreating shriek from the depths of the ocean. The light was dying. "Kay! The locket! The feather!" Miles yelled, his voice ragged. "Throw the locket into the sea. And leave the feather here." Kay, snapping out of her shock, grabbed the silver locket and hurled it through the open window toward the churning, angry ocean below. Miles pressed the quill deeper into the burning scar on his hand, sacrificing the connection, turning the final anchor of the complete ritual into the very thing that broke it. As the locket hit the water, the lighthouse lamp exploded with a final, massive pop, plunging the chamber and the entire coastline into darkness. Miles and Kay stumbled out of the ruin lighthouse as the final, colossal boom of an undersea landslide, the true, final collapse of the deep gate, rattled the coast. The next morning, the authorities found nothing, no bodies, no man in the jumpsuit, no evidence of the monstrous pit thing. Just a ruined lighthouse, a collapsed building site, and a missing Captain Vance, all written off as a series of terrible accidents and rogue explosives. Miles and Kay were hailed as heroes, their impossible stories confined to the